Isn't it a blessing to be able to sing praises unto the Lord? Lift up our voices to the Most High. Well, we're going to get started again in our series through 1 Samuel. Now, I have not tried to pattern this after A.W. Pink. He's got a great book, nice big thick one, on the life of David. If you want more information, more in-depth study, it's a good book that you can get into and be able to use that. And you can get it online. You don't even have to purchase it. But I don't try to follow his. In fact, I make sure I don't even read his first. I go in there and read it afterwards. And he brings up a lot of good little things. But I've also learned he and I diverge from one another every once in a while, because there's some things in there. It's not a matter of doctrine. It's a matter of being able to interpret what's going on and finding out and figuring out what you think had happened. Well, along with this particular series where we're at, if last week we started talking about David's exile. And so we're going to continue on with that, David's exile part 2. Now, if you remember in our last study, we left David escaping the clutches of Saul by running into enemy territory. And if you remember, too, he actually ended up feigning that he was mad. And then he took off from there, and that's where we began to find out these different locations. And so I've patterned, even though this is one group of talking about David's exile, in most of this, the way that I've broke the passages down or divided them, it's not by incidents or circumstances, but by geography. And so you'll learn that tonight, the first place he's going to be is in the cave of Adullam. And the second place, he's going to be in Mizpah of Moab. And then in the third, which will take the remainder of our course of this chapter, it will be in the forests of Hereth. Now, again, when we began to look at this, not a lot about this particular cave, at least at this part, but once he had left and got away from the king of Gish, get that madman out of here. What do I have to do with a madman? David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. Now, this is something a lot of times people don't realize, that his family gathered around him. It's also the fact that this news gets around, and you're going to see that not only does his family find out, but Saul is even going to find out some information about his travels. This particular area is probably what they say is on the western slopes of the mountains of Judah, which is outside, again, Jerusalem. And it's that he took up a temporary residence here. This is in an actual cave, probably located in an area called Adullam, and that's the reason why it's given that name. It's not far from his home. So we know that's probably, too, why his family gathered around him. And for their own safety, we're going to learn something about his father and his mother. They're gotten older, but they're gathered together with him. So his family could be in danger. And, of course, David's location wasn't kept a secret. It seems to be that it was noised a little bit too much abroad, and his family hears about it and joins him. But they're not the only ones that join. In verse 2, you'll see the collection of the distressed, the debtors, and the discontented. All of these, and it says, and everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented. Now, that really doesn't sound like a good group of people, does it? Just from the idea that's there. But you have to notice something. They gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. Now, I believe that the Lord had caused these people to be drawn to David. He is the anointed. But this is an unusual list, but it doesn't tell you why they were in distress. It doesn't say why they were in debt or who they were in debt to. It doesn't say why they were discontented. It doesn't get into any of the details at all in these. Now, looking at just the words, the word distress has to do with being in anguish, or they're in a narrow strait, they're in a confined spot, there's some sort of pressure that's upon them. Debt, well, when it's talking about being in debt here, they're not just talking about just broke. They're in fact talking about being beyond broke. When you're in debt, that just doesn't mean you don't have any money. That means you owe somebody more than what you have. So they owned nothing and they owed everything. And then discontented, that's a weird word there. It has to do with the word that we can get bitter or even chafed from. Nowhere, though, does it call these people disreputable. In fact, I will tell you that this is where Pink goes on for quite a ways that he begins to talk about, because David is a type of Christ, and that these are like those people who follow Christ and become devoted followers of Christ, that we all have had a problem of some sort, that we were distressed by sin, we were in debt to God because of sin, we were discontented because of sin. Again, when people are feeling trapped or great anguish, again, why or how this all happened, we do not know, but we can identify emotionally with those words. So whatever it is that caused them to be distressed or in debt or discontented, we know those words in our own lives. And we need to be very careful that we would find them to be disreputable. In fact, I would say this: you need to be careful how you consider these who are later called men of renown that have gathered around David because of their devotion. I think you'll see that they're devoted to God, they're devoted to Jehovah, and they're devoted to David. In fact, we find one of them a little bit later to be the prophet Gad. Now, some will say, well, they think he was sent as a missionary or a messenger, I think he was probably one of those that were gathered to David. And you'll see a little bit more about him. I think, again, this group was primarily made up of men who were just what the word calls them, distressed, debt, and discontented, but I think they were devoted to Jehovah, and they were devoted to the anointed of God. We see that too, there were, if you look at the last, that he became a captain over them, and there were about 400 men. So it's not a small group of people. And when you start thinking about the care that would require, food, everything else that takes place here, and even where they're going to stay, that cave, if it held them all, was going to be a pretty good sized cave. But then we find what happens is from here, David ends up fleeing from that cave and goes into Mizpah of Moab. And David went thence. So again, what do we notice? We see David going from the cave of Adullam to Mizpah of Moab, and we're going to see again going to the forest of Haeth. David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. Now, again, I think this is a lot like when he went to Nob and to the priest Ahimelech there, that he went alone, but he was caring for the men, and part of that asking for bread was asking for them. Well, here, it seems to me the way he said it, I'm asking the king, here I pray thee, let my mother and father come forth. In other words, they may have not been right in his presence there. They may have been close by. I don't know exactly, but you can see what he wants. He wants a place of safety for them. And he's going to want them free from the clutches of Saul. David approaches the king of Moab seeking safety for his family. Now, nothing is said that Saul ever tried to get a hold of his father and his mother, but he doesn't speak of them very highly, nor does Doeg speak of them very highly. But he does not want to see his parents have to endure the rigors of being in exile and in danger because of their age and having to travel so much. Now, it's also interesting, if you think about it, David went thence to Mizpah of Moab. You might not think anything about that. We might just read right over top of that and not think a little bit, well, why would he go here? Why does he go to the enemy again? Well, he did, if you remember, went to the Philistines and to Gish and to the king that was there, but he didn't stay because they were not sympathetic. They were, would just as soon have killed David if they didn't think he was crazy. But here, Moab. Anybody remember anything about the Moabites? In fact, can you remember anything about a woman by the name of Ruth the Moabitess? Yes, his great-grandmother came from there. So he found a location that he thought would be sympathetic to having them there. Notice also when it says, let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you. Notice what he says, till I know what God will do for me. I think when you start looking at this, David is not making those 400 men that have gathered around him the source of his confidence or trust. He's looking to God. He's looking for the Lord as his source of hope for his future. He is looking to the hand of God as his preservation. And of course, then he gains approval, sets his parents in safety with the enemy. And verse 4, it says, and he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. Now, that's again a strange word, in the hold. So I think as far as I can understand, that has to do with that fortification that's there. But the hold, I think, refers to the land that was under the control of the Moabites. And or in that location where it's his hideout. So whenever, as long as he was hiding out while he's in exile, his mom and dad stayed there with the Moabites. So the hold seems to be not a particular name of a location, but the whole general area where he was holding up and trying to escape Saul. From there, not only then we go from the cave of Adullam to Mizpah of Moab, but then we find him in the forest of Hareth. And the prophet Gad. Now, this is the prophet Gad. And what does he do? He comes down to David and he says, abide not in the hold. Don't stay here. Depart and get thee into the land of Judah. So it's not just a general, again, not just a general place in which David is hiding and everywhere that he hid was a hold, but it's the place that was in Moab. At least that's what I believe it is. But he says the prophet Gad, tell him, you know what? You need to get down to the land of Judah. And what does he do? David departs and came into the forest of Hareth. So in each verse, as you progress through this, and in fact, chapter 21, chapter 22, and chapter 23 are all very much connected together where he is traveling. And you learn a little bit more about where he's at. You'll learn a little bit more about who was the part of that 400, who else was with him. You'll also learn a little bit more about even this fellow, the prophet Gad. In fact, you'd have to go clear into the second book of Samuel. And in the second book of Samuel, chapter 22 and verse 11, Gad, it says, is called David's seer. He's the prophet Gad, David's seer. What does that mean? That means whenever David inquired of the Lord, he got a hold of the prophet Gad. He wanted to know what God was doing. In fact, in the next chapter, you'll find him inquiring of the Lord for every particular question that he had in his mind. I don't want to get in and teach it ahead of time, but if only we would do that every time we had a question about where we're going, what we're doing. Inquire of the Lord. Should we do this? Should we go there? That's exactly what David does. He is the one, of course, I believe, that God sent to David, and it's also a very hard situation that he is also the one that, if you remember, David sinned when he numbered the people of Israel, and the prophet Gad came to him and he said, you got three choices. Which one will you take? That was the guy that's involved in that. So you'll learn a little bit more about that in the next chapter as well. In the meantime, then, while he's in this area and before the people, because you'll find that in the very next chapter, while he's there, the people will get a hold of him and saying, hey, the Philistines are attacking us. They don't ask him for help. We don't see that asked, but it seems pretty obvious that's what they're doing. But in the meantime, again, while we read this as the location of David and his men, they are, in fact, discovered by Saul. And I want you to note the circumstances that we see in verse 6. It says, and when Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all of his servants were standing about him. Well, doesn't that just strike you as a slight bit odd? He's at home. He's surrounded by his servants, but what is in his hand? Yeah, his spear. Now, what has he done twice with his spear? He's chucked it at David, trying to stick him to the wall. And even now with Jonathan, because he thinks there's a conspiracy there. So when David hears this, or when Saul hears it, I mean, it's just like he's an angry, mad, bitter man. And he is just ready to go after David at a moment's notice. Saul, of course, is in his hometown. And he is, I believe, a man filled with bitterness, hate, and with pride. And he is prepared to hurl his spear again at David and pin him to the wall. Verse 7, then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? In other words, he's going to tell them something a little bit more, but it's kind of like he's already laying out here. He feels like there's a big conspiracy, like a lot of other people, big conspiracy theorists. Well, let's look and see what the rest of it he does. And he's basically telling them, look, you need to not follow David because he's not going to show you any kindness. He's going to be against you. That's not the truth. But verse 8, so he's not only suspicious of David, he is suspicious of everyone around him. He's already suspicious of his own son. And he tells them, after he said that he's not going to make you captains of thousands and captains of hundreds, he's not going to give you the gift of fields and vineyards, and he says that all of you have conspired against me. And there is none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse. So nobody revealed that my son was involved in this conspiracy. And there is none of you that is sorry for me. Wah, wah, wah. I mean, that just sounds kind of odd right there. Nobody's sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. So he's blaming them for this whole situation. He's blaming them for being dishonest, and there is a conspiracy. So he's suspicious of everyone. Instead of seeing his own behavior as the problem, he sees the problem as belonging to everyone else. Don't forget what happened when God anointed David. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David. What happened with Saul? The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit. That hasn't stopped. He is still a man that is just full of wickedness, hate, and pride. Now, of course, what happens here says, all of you have conspired against me. Nobody's there. Nobody's helping me out. Nobody has his back. No one has compassion for him. Oh, wait. There is one man. Out of all those men, there's one man. Verse 9. Then answered Doeg the Edomite. Then answered. I don't know, did you hear a question in all of that? Doeg is an opportunist. He is a wicked opportunist. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, now, maybe Saul did ask, does anybody know where David's at in particular? And then Doeg pipes up, but we don't know that, but he says, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And basically, when you see this, David, when he ran, of course, he ran from Saul, got the showbread, got the sword, and he got the inquiry. The Ahimelech did inquire of him for the Lord. But again, he's an opportunistic, wicked man. Look what else he says, verse 10. And he inquired of the Lord for him. That's what Ahimelech did. And gave him victuals. And gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. Doeg started this up, and he told him everything that happened. Saul has called for Ahimelech and all the priests to come before him, and then what do we read? Verses 12 and 13. And Saul said, hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, here am I, my Lord. And Saul said unto him, why have you conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him? But notice that last part, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as at this day. What does he think that's going on? He thinks that David has collected an army and he's lying in wait. At the first opportunity, he's going to try and kill Saul. That's his conspiracy theory. It is that last part of that question that he lays out there. Why have you done this? And of course, that part was totally untrue, and it was a conclusion that was provided by himself according to his own wicked heart. He was putting on David what he would do. He was putting on David what he is doing, in fact. And so what does the priest do? He answers him in verse 14. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and tell me if this doesn't sound like just exactly what Jonathan said about David. And who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding? Of course, that part right there, we know David fibbed a little bit when he was telling him what was going on and is honorable in thy house. He didn't have any conspiracy against Saul, and he's letting them know, listen, David is your faithful servant. David is your son-in-law. David came and he told us he's going doing your bidding and he's honorable. This is my thinking. That's exactly what he told Ahimelech. And verse 15, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? In other words, I didn't inquire in God of how he ought to lay in wait or how he ought to kill you, or where he would find safety. He says, let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father. For thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. Again, he's telling Saul, I didn't know any of this. I don't know any of that which is going on. So again, the same thoughts that Jonathan brought to Saul are the same thoughts that Ahimelech brings to Saul. And he really does let him know, I gave him no protection. I didn't provide him anything. He told me he was on a mission from you, and I provided him what he had need of because he told me he had to leave so quickly he couldn't get anything else. So what does he do? And the king ignores every bit of what he says and said, thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. Saul heard nothing but conspiracy, lies, and guilt, guilt, guilt. David was who he feared the most. He had this purpose in mind, I think, when he first heard the charges. I'd say I think David did when he first heard or saw that Doeg was even there. And there's just, Saul's not going to allow anything to stop him from arresting and taking the life of David and cause fear. I think that's part of it too. He's wanting fear to flood the minds of anybody, lest you think that if you help David out, I'm going to put the fear of God in you. That if you help David, I'm going to kill you and your family and your household. He wouldn't allow nothing to stop him. Verse 17, and the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, turn and slay the priest of the Lord. Isn't that a strange thing to say? Slay the priests of the Lord. Because their hand also is with David. And because they knew when he fled and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priest of the Lord. Well, amen. They had some morals. They had some values. They didn't believe what was in Saul's mind and his conspiracy theory. Saul did not have the truth, nor did he know the motives which belong to the priest of Jehovah. All he had was an evil spirit which moved him, and the men that were there with him knew exactly what motivated Saul to want to kill David. They must have given Saul their reasons, else Saul would have turned on them too. I don't know if that's the case or not. Or because they were his guards and footmen, his protectors, he couldn't let anything happen to them, because if he killed them, he wouldn't have any protection. Well, here's what goes on. And so verse 18, and the king said to Doeg, he picked out the right guy for this job. Turn thou and fall upon the priest. And Doeg the Edomite turned and fell upon the priest, and slew on that day fourscore persons that did wear a linen ephod. That doesn't tell you that's the only people he killed, but he's telling you he killed at least 85 priests. If they had others that were traveling with them and helping them, but we know that he killed them. Saul recognized the one who brought the charges and gave him orders, or gave him the orders to kill them all. Not only did he do that, but notice verse 19. Doeg must have been just as angry and bitter as was Saul. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. Doesn't that remind you or make you think just a little bit, because it talks about women, children, and men, And then it mentions oxen and asses and sheep. Saul has them all killed. Do you remember when Saul was commanded of the Lord to go down and kill the king and all his people, that whole city, and don't let anything stay alive, not even the animals? And then Samuel shows up, if you remember, and he says, well, hey, I did everything I was commanded to do. And Samuel said, well, wait a minute, what's that then, the bleating of the sheep that I'm hearing? You were disobedient to God when he told you to kill everybody. But here, God didn't tell you to kill anybody, and you're killing them all. And these are your own people. These are the priests of the Lord. That's exactly what he calls them. So why not act upon this paranoia, hatred, and fear of Saul? Well, that's exactly what he does do. But, praise God, there was one that got out. Verse 20, and one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Only one son could survive this slaughter. And, of course, Abiathar, well, we'll read just the next verse. Abiathar showed David that Saul slain the Lord's priest. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul. Look at the blame that he puts upon himself. I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. He took the blame. What a difference between Saul and David. Saul is blaming everybody except himself. David doesn't blame anybody. I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. I mean, what guilt must have been laid upon David's heart when he heard this news? That's why there are at least 3 different psalms that you can go in and look that have to do with this particular accounting and what was taking place. He wrote about it. He wrote about the terrible experience and the emotions. So now what happens is the least that David can do is to seek to protect Abiathar's life. So he said, here's what he does. He says, abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life. We're connected at the hips now. So you stay with me, and with me thou shalt be in safeguard. This is a safe place to be. This really, Abiathar, you'll find out, continues with David and is loyal to David throughout his life, and I should say until David dies himself. This act must also have moved upon the priests to favor David instead of an irrational and wicked king. I will at least give you one verse out of Psalm 52 that I believe this has to do with Doeg. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. The man that loved evil more than good, this man that had a deceitful tongue, this man, God will pluck him out of the land of the living. Read Psalm 52 when you get a chance. It's just a few verses that are there. David will leave this man's end with the Lord. He will not. I would think if that was me, first chance I'd got, I'd have sought to take Doeg out. But he doesn't. He leaves him in the hands of God. Pray that's been a blessing to you tonight. Just a real brief look at the 23 verses of chapter 22. And